The studio pulsed with restless anticipation as the late show kicked into gear. Stephen Colbert strode onto the set, his grin sharp and rehearsed, waving to the crowd before settling behind his desk. The audience roared as Elon Musk followed, his lanky frame cutting through the spotlight with a quiet intensity. His eyes swept the room, assessing it like a battlefield. The lights bore down, amplifying the weight of what promised to be a volatile night. Few could have predicted Stephen would end up ejecting Elon from the stage, but the fault lines were already forming. Stephen launched with a playful dig, ribbing Elon's knack for world-shaking ideas, then zeroed in on the night's real fuel, Elon's latest climate gambit. The tech titan had unveiled a plan to unleash solar-powered drones, seeding the atmosphere with reflective particles to cool the planet fast. A geoengineering Hail Mary that had the world divided. Stephen's brows arched as he tore into it with gusto, questioning if this was brilliance or just another rich man's ego trip. Was Elon out to save the Earth, or was he rolling the dice with it? Elon leaned back, cool at first, laying out the logic, science that could rewind decades of warming in a fraction of the time. His voice was crisp, grounded in data, but laced with a tension that clashed with Stephen's doubt. The host fired back, conjuring images of skies dulled by artificial fog, nature buckling under a plan no one fully understood. What made Elon think he could rewrite the planet? Who answered for the fallout if it failed? The crowd shifted, some egging Stephen on, others grumbling in Elon's corner. The back and forth sharpened as Stephen leaned harder into the ethics, accusing Elon of bypassing the messy reality of global agreement. His hands slashed the air, voice climbing, demanding to know if the world had volunteered for this or if Elon just assumed his genius overruled all. The audience fed off the friction, their reactions a tangle of cheers and jeers. Elon's fingers twitched against the chair, his poise thinning as he shot back with hard truths about melting ice caps and drowning coasts. Crises Stephen's jabs couldn't fix. But the host wasn't after answers, he was after blood. By the segment's end, the divide was stark. Stephen had framed Elon as a rogue visionary tinkering with the Earth like a toy, while Elon's terse replies hinted at a simmering resentment. The applause swung Stephen's way, his zingers hitting their mark. But Elon's silence grew heavier, his gaze slicing through the host's swagger. The commercial break beckoned, a brief reprieve, but the atmosphere thrummed with unresolved heat. How much could Elon swallow before he struck back? And when he did, who'd be left standing? The stage was set for a reckoning. The studio lights snapped back on as the late show returned from its break, the audience settling into a hum of expectation. Stephen Colbert reclined behind his desk, riding the high of his earlier jabs. His smirk suggested he'd already won the night. Elon Musk sat across from him, his posture rigid, the faint twitch in his jaw betraying the storm brewing beneath his calm. The geoengineering debate still hung in the air, a live wire neither man was ready to let go of. What had been a sparring match before the pause now felt like the prelude to a brawl. Stephen wasted no time diving back in with a barbed quip about Elon's drones turning the sky into a billionaire's canvas. He leaned forward, eyes glinting, pressing the guest on the human cost, farmers blindsided by shifting weather, communities left to choke on the fallout of untested tech. His tone dripped with accusation, framing Elon as a man too detached to care about the lives he'd disrupt. The crowd lapped it up, their laughter and claps fueling Stephen's momentum as he painted a vivid, grim picture of a world remade in Elon's image. Elon's response came slower this time, his voice low but cutting, slicing through the host's theatrics. He countered with cold precision, highlighting the millions already suffering from floods and heat waves, crises ignored by critics who'd rather mock than act. His words carried a weight that silenced some of the cheers, but Stephen brushed it off, pivoting to a personal dig. He questioned if Elon's obsession with grand fixes stemmed from a need to be seen as a savior, a messiah complex, dressed up in solar panels. The jab landed, and the audience erupted, emboldening Stephen to push further. The host's confidence swelled as he began to pace the stage, gesturing wildly, his voice rising to a crescendo. He challenged Elon to name one community he'd consulted, one voice from the ground he'd actually heard before launching his plan. The question hung there, sharp and taunting, and for a moment Elon's eyes narrowed, his fingers curling into a fist. He started to answer, citing a coalition of scientists and engineers, but Stephen cut him off mid-sentence, spinning to the crowd with a flourish, dismissing the response as more elitist noise. The interruption stung, and Elon's face hardened, a flicker of something dangerous crossing his features. The segment barreled toward its peak, Stephen now fully in control, his every word a hammer strike, aimed at Elon's armor. He circled back to the idea of accountability, asking who'd pay when the skies turned against them, who'd clean up the mess when Elon's gamble failed. The audience was his chorus, their reactions amplifying his dominance. But beneath the noise, Elon's silence grew deafening, his stare locked onto Stephen, unblinking, as if measuring the man across from him. The host, caught up in his own rhythm, didn't see the shift, not yet. The stage vibrated with the promise of a breaking point. The air, thick with the unspoken, felt charged. Elon's restraint was fraying, and when it snapped, it wouldn't be quiet. The studio air crackled as the late show barreled forward. The audience now a live wire of anticipation, feeding off Stephen Colbert's relentless assault. Behind his desk, Stephen was a conductor of chaos, his gestures sharp, his voice booming with a mix of mockery and righteous fury. Elon Musk sat opposite, a coiled spring masquerading as stillness, his face a mask of control that barely held. The geoengineering clash had morphed into something uglier, a personal vendetta. Stephen seemed determined to win, oblivious to the fault lines he was prying open. Stephen ramped up the attack, his sarcasm thicker now, questioning Elon's motives with a venom that felt rehearsed yet raw. He spun a tale of a man so enamored with his own brilliance that he'd risk the planet just to prove a point. His words were punctuated by exaggerated shrugs and knowing glances to the crowd. The audience roared, swept up in the spectacle, as he accused Elon of hiding behind numbers and tech, too cowardly to face the human wreckage his drones might leave behind. It was a performance, and Stephen was its star, basking in the glow of their approval. Elon's rebuttal grew terser, his voice a blade cutting through the noise. He pointed to the decades of inaction that had left the world teetering, the governments and pundits who'd failed while he at least tried. His logic was airtight, his passion seeping through the cracks of his restraint. But Stephen wouldn't yield the stage. The host pounced on every pause, twisting Elon's words into sound bites for the crowd to jeer at, his interruptions relentless. He mocked Elon's intensity, suggesting it was all a show, a tantrum from a man who couldn't handle being questioned. The laughter swelled, and Elon's knuckles whitened against the armrest. The tipping point loomed as Stephen, emboldened, crossed a line. He leaned in close, voice dropping to a conspiratorial hush, asking if Elon's real plan was to abandon Earth once he'd broken it off to Mars with his riches, while the rest burned. The accusation was absurd, a cheap shot, but the crowd ate it up, their cheers drowning out Elon's attempt to respond. Stephen straightened, arms wide, soaking in the noise, his triumph absolute. He didn't see Elon's eyes darken, didn't catch the way his breath steadied as if a decision had been made. The host had misjudged his prey, mistaking silence for surrender. The segment teetered on the edge, Stephen still riding his wave, oblivious to the shift. He launched into a final flourish, demanding Elon admit he'd never cared about the people, only the glory. The words hung there, a gauntlet thrown, and for a heartbeat, the studio held its breath. Elon's head tilted slightly, his gaze locking onto Stephen with a predator's focus. The audience didn't notice, too caught in the host's orbit, but the crew did, stagehands exchanging glances, sensing the air turn electric. Stephen, drunk on his own momentum, grinned wider, unaware he'd just handed Elon the match to burn it all down. The studio vibrated with a tension so thick it seemed to hum. Under the lights of the late show, Stephen Colbert stood at the helm, chest puffed, his latest barb about Elon Musk's supposed apathy, still echoing through the applause. The audience was his army, their cheers a wall of sound that drowned out any dissent. Across from him Elon sat, his silence no longer passive but loaded, a cannon primed to fire. Stephen, intoxicated by his control, didn't see the shift, didn't realize he'd pushed too far, too personal, until the guest's voice cut through the din like a blade. Elon rose from his chair, slow and deliberate, his height casting a shadow that swallowed Stephen's bravado. His words came low at first, steady, stripping away the host's theatrics with surgical precision. He didn't shout, didn't need to. His tone carried the weight of a man who'd held his tongue long enough. He turned Stephen's accusation inside out, asking how a comedian who'd built a career on snark could claim any moral high ground. The crowd faltered, caught off guard as Elon dissected the hypocrisy, a man who mocked solutions but offered none, who profited off division while pretending to care. Stephen flinched, his grin faltering, but he tried to rally, stepping forward with a forced laugh to reclaim the narrative. Elon didn't give him the chance. His voice rose now, not in anger but in command, laying bare Stephen's game, how he twisted the geoengineering debate into a circus, ignoring the stakes for cheap points. He painted a picture of a world Stephen couldn't fathom, one where inaction wasn't noble but deadly, where people like him thrived on tearing down those who dared to act. The audience shifted, some clapping hesitantly, others stunned into silence as Elon's words hit harder than any punchline. The host scrambled, his interruptions weaker now, his jabs landing like wet paper. Elon pressed on, relentless, turning the spotlight back on Stephen's own record. Years of smug commentary with no skin in the game. He asked the crowd to think, who'd really abandon them? The man risking everything to fix a dying planet, or the one cashing checks off their outrage? The room tilted, Stephen's dominance crumbling as Elon's calm fury exposed the fragility of his act. The crew froze, cameras catching every angle of the host's unraveling, his face a mask of shock and defiance. Stephen snapped, his voice shrill as he ordered Elon off the set, pointing to the wings with a trembling hand. It was a desperate move, a last grasp at power, but it backfired. Elon didn't flinch, didn't storm off. He simply stood there, towering, letting the absurdity of the command hang in the air. The audience murmured, some booing Stephen now, the tide turning as Elon's presence alone made the host's outburst look small. Stephen shouted again, louder, but the damage was done. He'd lost the room, and Elon, with nothing left to prove, had already won. The studio lights seemed to dim, though they hadn't, as the Late Show reached its chaotic zenith. Stephen Colbert stood behind his desk, face flushed, his command for Elon Musk to leave still ringing in the air like a misfired gun. The audience, once his unwavering chorus, fractured into a mess of boos, gasps, and scattered applause, their loyalty shaken. Elon remained rooted, his frame a quiet monument to the storm he'd unleashed, his eyes fixed on Stephen, with a look that wasn't anger, but something colder, disdain. The host's unraveling was complete, and the guest had turned the night into his own. Stephen tried to salvage it, his voice cracking as he doubled down, gesturing to the crew to cut to commercial, to eject Elon, anything to stop the bleeding. But the cameras stayed rolling, capturing every stutter, every bead of sweat on his brow. Elon didn't move, didn't need to. His stillness was louder than Stephen's flailing. He spoke again, softer now, almost conversational, asking the crowd if they'd ever wondered why men like Stephen clung so hard to tearing others down. It wasn't a question that begged an answer. It was a statement, a final nail driven with precision. The room tilted further, more voices rising against the host, the tide now a flood. The guest's triumph wasn't in volume or theatrics, but in the raw clarity he'd brought to the stage. He stepped forward, not to leave but to face the audience directly, laying out the stakes of the world they lived in, flooded cities, scorched fields, a future slipping away while men like Stephen fiddled with their microphones. His words weren't a plea, they were a reckoning, and the crowd felt it, their murmurs turning to nods, some standing in quiet defiance of the host's earlier reign. Stephen's desk, once a throne, now looked like a prop in a play gone wrong. The host sank into his chair, defeated, his hands fumbling with papers, as if they could shield him from the shift. Elon, sensing the fight was over, offered a final nod, not to Stephen, but to the people watching, a gesture that said he'd come for them, not the man crumbling behind him. Then he walked off, his exit calm, deliberate, leaving the stage not because he'd been told to, but because he'd said all he needed. The audience erupted, some in awe, others in fury, but none indifferent. The night had seared itself into them. Stephen sat alone as the lights finally dimmed for real, the crew scrambling to pivot, the applause fading into an uneasy hum. He stared at the desk, his smirk long gone, replaced by a hollow look that betrayed the cost of his misstep. Elon had flipped the script, not with rage, but with a truth so sharp it cut through years of polished persona. The show stumbled to its close, Stephen muttering a weak sign-off, but the story was already out of his hands. The guest had walked away the victor, leaving the host to stew in a silence louder than any crowd. The night ended not with a bang, but with a man exposed and another unbowed.